Okay, this is our last lecture for the Shinto course, and since last week we talked a good amount about challenges and some of the difficulties Shinto is facing, I thought we'd talk about some more of the fun stuff this week, Shinto in popular culture, as well as some popular trends which may help revitalize Shinto in various ways. So, Shinto in the environment, and this is something we've talked about a little bit, but I want to focus on a little bit more because it's really quite important and definitely one of the ways that the Shinto establishment sees itself as revitalizing Shinto in today's world. So, the idea of Shinto as a nature religion is probably not a new idea to you because I think it is a perception that many of us in the West do have. So we may think of it in terms of, sort of today's parlance, Shinto sort of presenting itself as a green religion, or in Japan, the sort of buzzword for green or ecological is eco. And that's certainly one thing that we see Shinto presenting itself as. So it's sort of an adaptation of the idea of Shinto's appreciation for nature, for natural phenomena, as being sort of natural or ecological awareness being a natural outgrowth of that appreciation for the natural world. And so a buzzword that's become increasingly common is this idea of sacred forests. You certainly have these in Japan before now, but it's become, definitely a buzzword you see more and more in terms of the forests attached to shrines being sacred in and of themselves, part of the same sacred space. And one movement that has really come to the fore after the triple disaster, which again we talked about last week, is replanting the sacred forests associated with those shrines that were damaged. But this is not necessarily an unmixed blessing. For instance, there's a lot of emphasis on replanting these forests as pine trees, but they weren't always pine trees to begin with. There are more, trees that are more indigenous to Tohoku that probably should be planted, but that's not being part of the conversation. So in terms of how much individual Shinto shrines pay attention to actual environmental needs as opposed to their perception of what should be there and what a Shinto forest is, definitely is worth thinking about. You also have an idea of renewal in Shinto being a major thing, and this requires rebuilding shrines like Ise and Izumo, but there is an aspect of reuse, right? If we think to the example of Ise, the materials from the shrine in Ise that is destroyed are, kind of carefully taken apart and then given to other shrines for their own needs in terms of rebuilding and renovating. So that sort of gets at the, reduce, reuse, recycle thing, but is something that has been going on in Shinto for ages. So sort of a recontextualization of the shrine rebuilding process. So that begs the question of whether this is a new interpretation of Shinto. Certainly it's drawing on ideas that have been there, but it is a sort of adapting these key ideas of Shinto to the current situation. And it does allow for an interpretation of Shinto that is not connected to nationalism, right? So you certainly have the certain priests who are not involved in sort of the Jinja Honsho, the main Shinto organization's nationalist agenda, really turning to Shinto and the environment. And one of these, as you'll see if you look at the tagline for this book I put here, Sonoda Minoru, the priest that we've read his pamphlet much early on in the class, he is definitely a proponent of this being a core facet of Shinto that is relevant in the present day. So again, well suited to concerns about the environment, climate change, sort of reclaiming the idea of Shinto as a nature religion that can respond to these concerns. It's worth noting that you don't only see this in, sort of at Shinto shrines, but also the idea of Shinto as a nature religion in popular culture, including perhaps most famously in Princess Mononoke. Another idea that isn't specifically from Shinto but is intimately connected with Shinto in some cases in Japan is this idea of power spots. So this is a term that doesn't originally come from Japan. It essentially means places that either emanate or are a source of key energies from the earth. So these power spots are where you can feel the power, as the name suggests, but also where you might receive some healing or some energy or something like that. And probably from this description alone, it won't surprise you to know that this comes from the New Age and or spirituality trend of the 1990s, where various practices associated with New Age, either New Age religions or again New Age practices that many people didn't consider to be religions. Power spots are one of the many traditions coming out of this. So even though power spots and indeed the whole New Age trend is still definitely there, but not quite as vibrant as it once was, power spots are doing really well in Japan. They are indeed called power spotto. And they're found worldwide. Again, they do come from this worldwide trend. And certainly in Japan, you can find power spots featuring prominently in tour guides and in booklets about other parts of the world. And in general, these are found either in natural phenomena or in ancient sites. There is a sense of kind of returning back to sensibility of nature and how it works that the ancients had and that we in the modern world do not. So thinking about this worldwide, it's kind of a combination. For instance, you see the Grand Canyon, right? A natural phenomenon for sure, even though it is indeed grand. Stonehenge, right? Another really old site, but that is still very situated in nature. The Chocolate Hills in the Philippines, Angkor Wat, again, kind of a combination of natural phenomenon and ancient sites, either directly affiliated with religion or not. And so in the case of Japan, many of these are located at shrines. They're not necessarily the shrines themselves, although they may be. More commonly, they're a particular stone, a particular tree, a pond, or other natural phenomena that is on the shrine grounds. And Shinto is somewhat accepting of this, but not exactly. Shock of all shocks, the Jinja Honcho and a major shrine like Ise, they reject power spots. They don't actively, tell people like, oh, get away from the power spots, but they say, this is not part of what they do. It's not part of Shinto. It's sort of a deviation from it. However, for smaller shrines, especially some of those struggling shrines in rural areas, they see power spots as compatible with notions of kami, right? Just as a particular stone or tree or, mountain can be a kami, so the power spots are sort of bringing people back to the idea of what kami can be. And of course, it's no accident that these are the smaller shrines, right? They certainly welcome the rise in visitors that the Jinja Honcho and even Ise, as large as it is, can sort of ignore. But you see at one major shrine, Meiji Shrine, there's this well of clear water that comes out. That's a power spot. And Yudono Shrine, which I had the good fortune to go to in Yamagata, it is in some ways the shrine itself that's considered a power spot because the Shintai, or the god body, is a huge stone that has hot spring water sort of trailing around it. And so that is the power spot, but it's also the Shintai of this particular shrine. So a couple more power spots sort of to show you the variety in power spots and what they can be. Another one that I've been to is this sand sculpture in Kanonji in Kagawa. This is again in Shikoku. And this portrays, it's a sand sculpture of a old Japanese coin, the sen, but it's right by a particular Buddhist temple, Kanonji, which is also the name of the town, and has this, is in the midst of the forest with this beautiful view of the Seto Inland Sea. Mount Fuji itself is a power spot, shock of all shocks, not surprising, right? But you also have a relatively small thing in this snake stone, right? That's a stone that happens to have this, mineral aberration that looks like a snake, right? And you also have this Yakushima forest. The forest itself is considered a power spot. And if it looks familiar, that's because this forest is thought to have been the inspiration for Princess Mononoke. And finally, Shinto in popular culture and imagination. This is, of course, the subject of your third project in a lot of ways, but I thought this was worth talking about as a concept and a possible avenue for Shinto going forward. For instance, as will not surprise anyone in this class, Shinto elements frequently appear in popular culture, but it's worth thinking about how they appear and how they function. So Shinto, with its idea of kami being everywhere, animism, for instance, and with a wide variety of kami and what they can be, ends up being really good source material for spirits, demons, for concepts of fantasy used in various animation and games. Again, it sort of ends up being the sort of cultural default idea of spirits and how they work. It also serves as a marker of Japan or of Japaneseness. If you see a torii, then you know that you're in Japan and you're in, either Japan of the present day or the past, or a place that's very like Japan, right? So this we certainly see in popular culture, but we even see on maps sometimes, right? Or on representations of different countries. A torii can, because of how closely associated Shinto is with Japan itself, the torii can sort of be a stand-in for Japan, as can shrines or other aspects of Shinto. And it also can be a marker of tradition versus modernity, right? Even though we have shrines today, some shrines built relatively recently, there is a sense that shrines represent older Japan. And that's certainly the case in the movie Your Name, which I have a picture of the torii from here. That's the rural part of Japan as opposed to the modern part of Tokyo, where kind of the whole movie is set in these two locations. And again, something that won't surprise anyone is that Japanese pop culture is now popular worldwide, and that includes, again, Shinto and its perceptions. In all honesty, how many of you are here because you first got interested in either Japan itself or in Shinto specifically from anime, games, and other pop culture references to Shinto as a tradition? I'm sure it's quite a number of you. But this also reflects a greater worldwide interest in Shinto and shrines and Japanese traditions, again, stemming not entirely but partially from pop culture. It's no accident that Asian studies programs and Japanese programs have grown just as anime has grown. There is a clear correlation there. And this affects a lot of things, certainly tourism that comes to mind most readily, but also in terms of academia. Again, until fairly recently, most people who studied Japanese religion were studying Buddhism. That is, still somewhat the case, but it is changing. We see more academic positions and studies, devoted to Shinto, or at least open to Shinto. There's also a much larger foreign presence in Japan, certainly teaching English, but also at universities where they may also be learning about Shinto, or where courses on Japanese culture and history more generally would be presented. And I think it's worth noting that, again, shrines either have a somewhat ambivalent relationship with pop culture. Some actively embrace it. Some shrines in Japan, for instance, are Pokemon Go spots. Others tolerate it, but not very thrilled about it. And as you can imagine, there are some that reject it completely as either false, incorrect, or just not really capturing the essence of Shinto. But it'll be interesting to see how this develops going forward, and whether shrines that do embrace pop culture more actively do better. I suspect they will. Okay, so materials for the week. We only have readings for Monday and Wednesday. On Monday, you'll be reading about Shinto's perspectives in Spirited Away, sort of as an example for how Shinto does appear in popular culture, including the extremely famous Ghibli film Spirited Away. On Thursday, we'll have a final look at our textbook, actually going back to chapter 1 of A New History of Shinto, and thinking about an alternative approach to Shinto. That's the name of that chapter. And again, thinking about what this means. For videos, you'll see a short animated film. I should note a short animated film nominated for an Oscar several years ago that, again, deals with Shinto or aspects of Shinto in interesting ways, and a trailer for Spirited Away if you haven't seen it yet, which I hope you have, but in any case, this will give you a taste. And just a note that, as you can see in how I've been using it here, when you're citing and indeed writing about your particular anime films, etc., the title of that anime film or game should go in italics, whereas individual episode titles should go in quotation marks. This is very similar to how books versus book chapters, journals versus journal articles are cited. The article you'll be reading for Monday does not do this correctly, but so it goes. And discussion questions, I'd like to keep them broad and sort of in keeping with the idea that this is a, sort of final wrap up for our class. How have your impressions of Shinto changed since the beginning of the course? How would you define or describe Shinto now that you've learned a lot about Shinto's history, Shinto, how it's practiced today, enduring problems and possibilities? Which ideas from Shinto appear most often in pop culture? Why do you think those ideas do appear, and how are they used? Thinking about your projects as well as some of the pop culture we'll be talking about. And finally, which shrine or power spot would you most like to visit when finally we can go to Japan again? An important question. I wanted to finish off by thanking you for taking this course with me. It's certainly been a challenging quarter for us all, but I hope you've enjoyed learning about Shinto. And I encourage you to keep in touch with me, whether over Discord or email, and I wish you the best going forward. Thanks so much.